The curse and scandal of human nature. That's how James Otis Jr. described arbitrary power, which isn't just a sign of tyranny or a step towards tyranny. It's the very definition of tyranny itself. It's power without right and pervades the entire Declaration of Independence. But this wasn't a new principle during the American Revolution. It actually goes back thousands of years and became their reason to support written constitutions. The founders didn't just fear and fight against arbitrary power, they defined it and warned us about it. It leads to tyranny every single time. In this episode, we'll break it all down. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. So first, we should get a definition. What is arbitrary power? And for that, let's go to James Otis Jr., who described it this way in 1762. Arbitrary, which in plain English means no more than to do as one pleases. And Light Horse Harry Lee explained that same principle under the Constitution during the ratification debates. He said, when a question arises with respect to the legality of any power, exercised or assumed by Congress, it is plain on the side of the governed. Is it enumerated in the Constitution? If it be, it is legal and just. It is otherwise arbitrary and unconstitutional. So anytime they go beyond the limits of a constitution, it's arbitrary and lawless. And to James Otis Jr., this type of power, this arbitrary power, wasn't just dangerous, it was vile, it was corrupt. He called it the curse and scandal of human nature. And for the old revolutionaries like Otis and so many others, arbitrary power was the very definition of tyranny. And Otis was calling the British system, he was calling them out for violating their own unwritten constitution, their long-standing rules that everyone expected to be living by. Instead of honoring it, they were ruling the colonies through arbitrary power. And he said, a greater difference on this side of the grave cannot be found than that which subsists between British subjects and the slaves of tyranny. Not pulling any punches on that. And like I said right at the outset, this wasn't a new view for the founders, the old revolutionaries. This wasn't just a principle of the American Revolution. This goes back thousands of years. For example, Aristotle, and I think this is the 4th century BC, he put it like this in the Politics. This is book 5. He said, the true or typical form of tyranny is the arbitrary power of an individual crushing everybody alike and governing only for his own advantage and against the will of his subjects. A government, Aristotle wrote, which is detestable to freemen. And there are many other examples from the ancients that describe arbitrary power and tyranny in these types of terms, but we can see this kind of thought brought forward to people like John Locke in his 2 treatises on civil government. He put it like this: absolute arbitrary power, or governing without settled standing laws, can neither of them consist with the ends of society and government. And this same warning came through loud and clear in the pre-revolutionary press. For example, Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard, in their very famous and widely read, highly influential Cato's letters in the early part of the 18th century, the early 1720s. In 1722, in letter number 63, this is Thomas Gordon, he wrote about what happens when laws, rules for government are replaced by the will of tyrants, by arbitrary power. He said, thus in arbitrary countries, a law aged 2 days is an old law, and no law is suffered to be a standing law, but such as are found by long experience to be so very bad and so thoroughly destructive that human malice and all the arts of a tyrant's court cannot make them worse. So the only thing that sticks around is a thing that's absolutely terrible. It's a race to the bottom. It's a quick path to total tyranny. Now let's take it back to James Otis Jr. Here from his 1761 speech against the writs of assistance. I think this was like a 4 or 5 hour speech. Well, he put it like this. It appears to me the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty, and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book. And from there, Otis connected the dots. Laws made outside the limits of the Constitution, written, or at that time, of course, the unwritten British Constitution. Well, laws made outside the Constitution are no law at all. He put it like this: an act against the Constitution is void. And John Adams, years later, he described this speech really as the start of the American Revolution, that radical change in the viewpoints of the people between 1761 until 1775 and the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord. Here's how he put it in a letter to William Tudor Sr. I think this was 1817. Of course, this will all be linked to in the show notes. I'll get more into that in just a moment. He said, Otis was a flame of fire. American independence was then and there born. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, the child independence was born. In 15 years, i.e. 1776, he grew up to manhood and declared himself free. This rejection of arbitrary power wasn't just from a single dude, James Otis, and supported by John Adams decades later. It wasn't just a flashpoint in Boston. It echoed across every colony in speeches, resolutions, revolutionary writings, and so much more. Here, for example, in October of 1774, representatives from the 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. They were very concerned, for example, about the arbitrary power of the coercive acts, what many people today wrongly call the intolerable acts. And they passed unanimously the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. This is October 14th, 1774. And here's a quick excerpt. The good people of the several colonies, and they list them, justly alarmed at these arbitrary proceedings of Parliament and administration, have severally elected, constituted, and appointed deputies to meet in order to obtain such establishment as that their religion, laws, and liberties may not be subverted. Arbitrary power was the reason that there was a First Continental Congress. They said it exactly right there. And then the following week, on October 21st, 1774, they unanimously passed John Jay's address, what he drafted, an address to the people of Great Britain. And here's how John Jay put it: that we think the legislature of Great Britain is not authorized by the Constitution to establish a religion fraught with sanguinary and impious tenets, or to erect an arbitrary form of government in any quarter of the globe. These rights we, as well as you, deem sacred. And yet, sacred as they are, they have, with many others, been repeatedly and flagrantly violated. So again, over and over and over, we're hearing about the problems of arbitrary power. And few people really described arbitrary power more forcefully than the great patriot and Revolutionary War hero, Dr. Joseph Warren. In his 1775 Massacre Day oration, they commemorated, it was a solemn kind of public commemoration every year, and they had a different keynote speaker after the massacre every year, starting in 1771. And Joseph Warren, I believe, is the only person who gave a speech twice. Here he is in 1775, literally just weeks before the shot heard round the world, and not too much longer before Warren lost his life in the battle at Bunker Hill. And here's how he put it: But savages and death with torture were far less terrible than slavery. Nothing was so much the object of their abhorrence as a tyrant's power. They knew that it was more safe to dwell with man in his most unpolished state than in a country where arbitrary power prevails. In a time of history where everyone pretty much thought that without government it was going to be total chaos, total destruction of life and property, here's Joseph Warren saying, well, we'd be better off without this institution than an institution based on arbitrary power. Now, this wasn't just passionate rhetoric from Joseph Warren and John Jay in the First Continental Congress and James Otis Jr. and so many others. It was also a very hard-line principle, and no one stated that principle probably more forcefully than Samuel Adams in his Rights of the Colonists. This was passed in November of 1772. He said the legislative has no right to absolute arbitrary power over the lives and fortunes of the people. And absolute and arbitrary power, as we're going to see in a little bit, really kind of get blended, because once you allow them to have arbitrary power, it's always that road to total tyranny. And of course, then we get the Declaration of Independence. Now, most people refer to that list of stuff in there, those complaints, as grievances. Those charges against the king are a bunch of grievances. But the word grievance is not used in the document. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. I don't believe, at least from my last read last night, I don't remember seeing it in rough drafts from Jefferson either. Instead, they use things like this: a long train of abuses and usurpations, or a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. That's because a usurpation of power is an exercise of power without right. It's really synonymous with arbitrary power. It's power that's stolen from the source of all power, people, the people themselves. It's power without consent, power without right. That, by definition, really is arbitrary power. And that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson called it in his original draft. That went through some revisions from like around June 10th or 11th through the 4th of July, of course. And here's how he put it: but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, begun at a distinguished period, and pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to subject them to arbitrary power, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. And notice he said, designed to subject them to arbitrary power. Now, Benjamin Franklin did actually suggest a change, and rather than subjecting them to arbitrary power, they changed it to reduce them under absolute despotism. That's in the final text of the Declaration of Independence. And really, they weren't saying that any act of arbitrary power, that every act of arbitrary power and all acts of arbitrary power justified a total revolution, potentially a war for independence, abolition of the government, alter and abolish. That's because if you did that, recognizing human nature and the nature of government, you'd have a revolution every 35 seconds or so. Here's how Jefferson put it, and this is what made it into the final text as well. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So they were saying that when it becomes a design, a system of arbitrary power constantly, that's absolute despotism. And that's what must be altered or abolished. It's what must be thrown off. And I think this part bears repeating from the Declaration of Independence. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now, I realize I'm blasting through all this information pretty quickly, and honestly, I'm just scratching the surface, providing you some of the highlights of all these important original source documents, and hopefully you're thinking, Bolden, where the heck can I find this stuff? How can I read more in context on my own time? Well, lucky for you, the 10th Amendment Center, for every single episode of the Path to Liberty podcast, we publish a blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. My buddy Alan Mosley does an awesome, super consistent job of knocking these out, getting them organized. And in each blog post, below the introduction and the audio and video player, you're going to find a show links section, which, as long as I do a good job with my outline and my notes that I provide to Alan, they'll generally be in the order that I go through them in the episode. That way, of course, you can read and learn more in context on your own time, because again, I'm scratching the surface and there is a lot more to read and learn later on. So we'll get that published. Alan will get it organized. I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So let's get back to it. And we've been talking about the Declaration of Independence and how arbitrary power, usurpations of power, tyranny pervade the entire document. And by the time that Thomas Paine picked up his pen again for the American Crisis number 3, this is in the spring of 1777, the War for Independence was in full swing, but the principle was still there. It was rock solid. It hadn't changed at all. They were still fighting against arbitrary power, and Paine gave them a nice reminder where that all came from. And it started with the Declaratory Act of 1766, which claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. He started his first edition, or the first of the American Crisis essays, in December of 1776 with that famous line, "These are the times that try men's souls." But he went right into talking about the arbitrary and unlimited power of the Declaratory Act, where he said, such a great power can belong only to God. This is, even the phrase itself, he said, is impious. But here he is in the third American Crisis. He said, one of the greatest degrees of sentimental union which America ever knew was in denying the right of the British Parliament to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Declaration is, in its form, an almighty one, and is the loftiest stretch of arbitrary power that ever one set of men or one country claimed over another. And the founders and old revolutionaries, they understood exactly what arbitrary power would lead to. If you let them get away with it, it always leads to more arbitrary power. And if you let them get away with it, it always leads to more arbitrary power. And this is how John Dickinson put it in his very famous and widely read Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, first written in 1767, but published weekly or so from 67 into 1768. He said, when an act injurious to freedom has once been done, and the people bear it, the repetition of it is more likely to meet with submission. Arbitrary power leads to arbitrary power, which leads to arbitrary power, and eventually it's total tyranny. The founding generation, the old revolutionaries, they were great students of history, especially in comparison to those of us today. And they learned from the people that they studied and learned from, and just through the pages of history, that without fixed limits, even the best system of government would eventually turn to tyranny. And John Locke put it like this: the legislative or supreme authority cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary or arbitrary decrees. That's a tough one. But it is bound to dispense justice and decide the rights of the subject by promulgated standing laws and known authorized judges. I mean, this should be pretty straightforward stuff. When government has power to do stuff, government has to stay within the rules that have been given to government. And even if government gave itself the rules, it can't just change them on a whim because that's arbitrary decrees. And that is the definition of tyranny. And even before Locke, there's a guy that we don't cover here too often, but probably should. James Harrington in the Commonwealth of Oceania. I believe this was written in like the 1650s or so. I might have the date totally wrong on that. But he captured this principle in, well, one really famous phrase: a government of laws and not of men. And for the old revolutionaries, this wasn't just mere theory. This wasn't just an idea. It was a hard line in the sand. And Samuel Adams, along with James Otis Jr., in early 1768, upon the urging of John Dickinson, who sent to Otis those letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, late December of 1767, he's like, look at this stuff, read it. I think it has some really important principles. They did become the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January of 1776. So they were really powerful essays. Well, he sent them along to James Otis. He knew that Otis was working with Adams, and the Bostonians had done some awesome stuff, especially in response to the Stamp Act. And he's like, well, you know, some people are thinking this Townsend Act stuff isn't as bad, but we've got problems with precedent and arbitrary power. So why don't you guys read through this and see what you can do in Massachusetts, in Boston, and maybe get the word spread about this. And they did. And they issued what's known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter, establishing or reiterating some of these principles and sending them out to the various other colonies. We know that George Washington and George Mason responded by organizing non-importation shortly after getting that in Virginia. But I'll get to that in another episode. Anyways, here's how Adams and Otis put it. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a free state if the people themselves, the source of all power, change their constitution. But the rules for government are rules for government, and government doesn't get to change the rules given to the government. Otherwise, it destroys the whole system. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. And as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. And many years later, St. George Tucker, in his great View of the Constitution of the United States, he explained that the American Revolution, the War for Independence, is what led to written constitutions, whether it was in Massachusetts and Virginia, or the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution for the United States. Basically, written rules. You don't have to love or hate any of them, but just to understand why they existed. Here's how Tucker put it. The American Revolution seems to have given birth to this new political phenomenon. In every state, a written constitution was framed and adopted by the people, both in their individual and sovereign capacity and character. So he's also affirming that sovereign capacity, sovereignty meaning final authority, the source of power, is the people. And as Samuel Adams put it years earlier, the government gets its rules from the Constitution, which comes from the people themselves. From there, Tucker gave a bunch of reasons why they did this, why they went with written constitutions rather than some other version of the unwritten British system that they had lived under for their entire lives. Well, first of all, it explained that government is just an agent of the people, made it very clear. He wrote, by this means, the just distinction between the sovereignty and the government was rendered familiar to every intelligent mind. The former was found to reside in the people and to be unalienable from them. The latter in their servants and agents. So sovereignty, final authority is with the people, and government under the Constitution only acts as a servant and an agent at whatever level. We're talking about primarily federal and state constitutions here. But next up, he wrote that it was also to make clear what the rules for government would be. He said, by this means also, government was reduced to its elements. Its object was defined. Its principles ascertained. Its powers limited and fixed, like Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr. put it in 1768. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. And for Tucker, without a written Constitution, with powers ascertained or principles ascertained, powers limited and fixed, well, without that, things are only going to move in one direction, and it's not going to be good at all. He said, the advantages of a written Constitution, considered as the original contract of society, must immediately strike every reflecting mind. Power, when undefined, soon becomes tyranny. And because of that principle, written constitutions also kind of serve as a beacon. They serve as an early warning system, at least if the people read and understand it and want to. And Tucker put it like this: a written constitution has, moreover, the peculiar advantage of serving as a beacon to apprise the people when their rights and liberties are invaded or in danger. And Thomas Jefferson, in his great arguments against the constitutionality of Alexander Hamilton's National Bank in February of 1791, on the 15th, this is 10 months to the day before ratification of the Bill of Rights, he tied it all together, Thomas Jefferson did. Acts outside the Constitution aren't just bad policy. They aren't just mere mistakes. They're usurpations of power, and usurpations of power are arbitrary power. And when usurpations are tolerated or cheered on, which is even worse, they create a precedent. And that precedent leads to more arbitrary power. This is the path to unlimited power, total tyranny. And Jefferson put it like this: I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. But wait, there's more. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. Luther Martin, one of the most outspoken and widely read anti-federalists during the ratification debates, well, he brought it all back to the American Revolution, and you can see how he connects the dots here. He said, by the principles of the American Revolution, arbitrary power may and ought to be resisted, even by arms, if necessary. Certainly, that's exactly what happened with the Declaration of Independence. That's exactly what happened in the War for Independence, and that was a founding principle of the entire American Revolution. Resist the first approaches of tyranny. Mercy Otis Warren, with that line, wasn't just giving us a suggestion. She was giving us a rule for survival. If you want liberty to exist, you have to follow that approach. You can't wait until it feels like tyranny, and you can't wait until it's obviously tyranny, because by then, you've probably already lost. If power is not authorized under the Constitution, if power is not delegated, it's arbitrary power. And that's the kind of system that the founders and old revolutionaries, well, they fought a long, bloody war to secede from it. Not one step beyond the Constitution, not one exception, not one emergency power, because all arbitrary power is usurpation, and all usurpation is tyranny, no matter who is exercising that power, and no matter why it's being exercised. It must be rejected. Not next year, not next month, not next week. Today, not tomorrow, right now. These aren't just good ideas. These are foundational principles from the American Revolution. It pervades the entire Declaration of Independence. It's the foundation of the constitutions of the states, of the Articles of Confederation, of the Constitution for the United States, and we never learn any of this stuff in government-run and government-approved schools. I know I didn't. Hopefully somebody out there did. Let me know if you did. But that's a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the TAC to reach and teach more and more people about this forgotten and ignored history, about these principles from the founders, the old revolutionaries, and way further back as well. And nothing helps us do that work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC, so we make those couple of bucks go a long, long way. But we do also have other options. Annual, 5-year, and lifetime options, whatever you can afford. I'm very grateful for that. And if you don't want to be a member, that's totally fine as well. As long as you're here learning, that's more important than anything. But if you want to help us out financially but not become a member, or you're already a member, which is really awesome, and you want to pitch in a little bit more, wanted to make sure you know where you can do that. The link is 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Of course, there's a bunch of other things that you can do to help us spread the word that are free and easy peasy, like hitting the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archive on whatever platform you watch or listen on, wherever you can leave comments and likes and all that stuff. That helps out a great deal. And then a big one, especially on video platforms like YouTube, for example, the more watch time percentage you get. So it doesn't matter the amount of time, it's the percentage of the total video. If you watch over 100%, that helps out a lot. You're a big hitter and a lot of support for doing that. But whatever you do, I'm very grateful for it. I'm really more than anything grateful that you're still here listening to me talk about this and explain things. So I hope this was interesting. I hope it was educational. Hope at times maybe it was a little bit entertaining. I do my best to do a little bit of all of it. But more important than anything, of course, I hope that this episode made you think, and I hope you learned something. We're going to get that blog post published so you can read through all the show notes and all the reference links in a couple of hours. That'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But in the meantime, thanks again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.